You're listening to Non-Toxic. I'm your host, Daniel Penny. My guest today is a former colleague of mine from The New Yorker, the journalist Nicolas Niarchos, with a new book called The Elements of Power. It's a global investigation of the battery supply chain stretching from Congo to Indonesia to the US and China. And I think it does a pretty amazing job of telling the story of how this technology that may save us from dependence on fossil fuels is also deeply intertwined with violence, child labor, and all kinds of atrocities that most people who care about sustainability would very much want to avoid if they knew about them.
I was looking into the connection between artisanal mining and a separatist militia in the south. I went to meet with these people who'd been trying to set up the rebel interview, and they had these other people who were supposed to be emissaries from the rebel leader, who was a reputed cannibal. And suddenly there were troops armed surrounding the hotel that I was in, and I was kind of being dragged out.
This conversation is part of a series I've been doing on Non-Toxic, which I'm calling the Performative Male Book Club. So if you want to hear other talks I've done with authors over the years, you can click on the Performative Male Book Club tag on Substack, and it will show you all the other author interviews I've done. If you have been listening and supporting the show for a while, head over to substack.com/nontoxicpodcast/subscribe and become a paying subscriber. Now, here's my conversation with Nicolas on his book, The Elements of Power. Nicolas, thank you so much for coming on Non-Toxic. It's a pleasure to have you and to see that this book is finally coming to light after a long period in the darkness.
It's been a long period of gestation. I think you heard about it several years ago. I can't remember when.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So back when we were both lowly staffers at The New Yorker, you mentioned to me that you were thinking of writing a story about cobalt.
One of the first things that I covered for the website of the magazine was the European refugee crisis. Refugees and migrants were coming over into Greece. And I noticed that there are obviously a lot of Syrians, a lot of Afghans, and we understood those conflicts very well. And then I started asking about what about the people who are not coming from conflict zones? Why are they coming to Europe? And a lot of these people were from the DRC. So I started looking at stories around corruption in the DRC. I found this guy called Dan Gertler, who was at the time, he'd just been sanctioned by the Justice Department, but he was still being paid by these mining companies. And they had found this way of paying him in euros, so they didn't incur the wrath of the US government or the Justice Department.
So that was essentially the germ of the story. And then I went down there, I realized that the story was much bigger than just this one guy who was an important person. He was egregious. He was involved in flipping these mines, and the Congo was losing a great deal of revenue because of him and so on. But he certainly wasn't the only person. He might have been one of the first, but there were many other people in that orbit. So I thought that was a fascinating thing. And then it just kind of developed from that.
Talk to me about that first reporting trip. I assume you went to see the mines yourself that first time.
So that first reporting trip was speculative because I was not particularly well plugged in at that point. And I said to myself, perhaps I'm going to go down and find nothing, and perhaps I'm going to just go down and find I'm not allowed onto these mine sites. And in fact, very quickly there, I met all these people who were saying, oh, well, no, you have to go out and see the mines. I said, how do I do that? And they said, oh, well, you can basically just walk on to some of them, which we did. And we being me and this Congolese journalist who I worked with for a long time, Jeff Kazadi, and some of them were saying, okay, well, you have to go and see the governor. So we went to the governor and got all these permits to go onto mine sites. But we also went to what were essentially illegal artisanal mining sites. And you see very young men and boys working on these sites.
For listeners who don't know what artisanal means in this context, so you might think of artisanal cheese. This is the opposite of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically kind of hand-mined cobalt. So, what we were looking at was people mining metals that were used in the battery industry, things like copper, cobalt, and the ores for those metals. And yeah, they're basically dug out by hand using very basic technology, things like metal pipes and occasionally sort of hammers and chisels. So it was a very basic way of mining. You would see people making the mining tools outside of these very deep pits that you were going into. They were using what was like a lawnmower motor to grind down these metal bars in order that people could use them to go down and dig out of the rock face, down these kind of shafts of 100 feet.
It seems very dangerous.
It is very dangerous, basically. I did not go down the pits. And there was one point that I thought that maybe it would be a good idea to go down. And then the Congolese journalist that I was working with said, look, that's the stupidest thing that you could imagine doing. I said, why? And they were like, well, these things collapsed the entire time, the amount of mine pit collapse that they had covered. And then the workers outside the mine said, don't go down either. They're really dangerous. And I realized that was also something that really, they were telling me not just because they thought, oh, well, who's this, random journalist who wants to go down the mines. It was because it was super dangerous. And then we walked into the assistant mining minister's office. I think that's what his title was, something like that, the next day. And he was on the phone with the governor and he was talking about a mine collapse in which tens of people had perished. So it was just kind of, and every time I was there, I heard stories about mine collapses and things that had happened very recently that day or a couple of days beforehand.
And they're collapsing because they're prone to collapse or because there are no safety measures?
They're collapsing because there are no safety measures, exactly. They're collapsing because it's very soft soil, which makes it easy to dig out, but it doesn't support itself, especially during the rainy season.
I think we should zoom out and talk about what cobalt even is. I think up until fairly recently, it wasn't a topic most people had heard of, and it wasn't even a mineral that many people in the mining industry were particularly interested in. So what role does cobalt play in lithium ion battery technology? Because that's kind of what's driving all of this. And why is cobalt so significant to the DRC? And where does the DRC fit within this bigger supply chain?
Cobalt is a dull gray metal. In some oxide forms, it has a blue color, which was used from pigments for a very long time. It was used to harden some forms of metal, but the big use case for cobalt today started in 1980. The lithium-ion battery, which is a kind of very powerful rechargeable battery, the type of battery that you have in your cell phone and your laptop, in many different devices. They figured out in 1980 that if you put a cobalt cathode, which is the positive electrode, lithium-ion battery basically works by having positive electrode and negative electrode, and then these ions that move across an electrolyte. As they do so, they release electricity, basically.
A lot of these use lithium because lithium sheds its electrons very easily, but it's also pretty unstable. We see all the time those scooters exploding because they're made with shoddy quality batteries.
Exactly.
So Congo is blessed or cursed to have one of the world's largest deposits of cobalt. Can you talk about how that was discovered and who started taking cobalt out of the ground? Where was it being sent? To whom was it being sent?
Cobalt comes with copper in the DRC. It's really important to acknowledge that it's a byproduct. Levels of cobalt production are really affected by levels of copper production. Very few mines are devoted to cobalt alone. Some artisanal miners will go to cobalt-rich seams, specifically at times of very high cobalt pricing, like right now. And obviously, prices really affect people's lives. But the deposits in the DRC were mined for thousands of years by traditional workers. In many ways, these people are kind of the forebears of today's artisanal miners. There were these smith kings who accrued power and influence through their trade of copper.
What were they doing with the metal thousands of years ago?
They were fashioning the metal into ingots, basically, these kind of cross-shaped ingots known as the Katanga cross, which was used as a sort of currency in pre-colonial Africa. And you found it as far north as the Sahara and all across. I mean, it was very widely traded, these ingots. But fast forward to the late 19th century, and you have the beginning of the colonial period, which is when King Leopold II of Belgium negotiates with the other European powers to control the watershed, the basin of the Congo River, which is this huge area. Everybody says, oh, it's the size of Western Europe. And it is the size of Western Europe. I think that's a kind of comparator. Many sizes times the size of Belgium, which is itself a very small country. Leopold takes it not as a colony at first, but as a private property, essentially. He says that what he's doing is charitable, and he says that what he's doing is a civilizing mission, essentially. Instead, begins brutally exploiting Congo, first for ivory and gold to some extent, and then for rubber. By the end of his period of rule in Congo, which ends around 1908, geologists have discovered these huge copper deposits in the south of Congo. I say discovered, that makes it sound as if nobody knew they were there. They were there being exploited by pre-colonial smiths and smith kings. So they go to these places and say, this is something that we need. This is something that we'll be able to sell on the international market. They figure out that copper is being used more and more for electronics. During the two world wars, copper consumption goes up. Congo becomes one of the world's biggest copper producing countries. And along with that, cobalt comes along because it's this byproduct of copper. So you can't disaggregate cobalt production from copper production in the south of the DRC.
Since the end of colonial rule by the Belgians, the DRC has suffered from decades of corruption and internal violence. How does the political situation affect the mining industry? And how does the mineral wealth affect the political situation? Because I think it's not kind of a one-way street there.
I think the political situation affects the mining industry in that Kinshasa understands that its paychecks come from the south of the DRC, the Katanga region, where all these mines are, where I visited. Those areas are so integral to the economy of the DRC that everything is done to stabilize them, and they are treated very poorly. The revenue from mining does not go back into those provinces. There's a desire to keep them safe and to keep them productive, but also to keep them somewhat underdeveloped. There was an attempt at secession backed by Belgium in the 1960s, which was done for reasons that were purely extractive. Belgium wanted to continue controlling the Congolese mining industry, and that failed. But powers like the US and various other international actors became involved in Congolese mining.
All of these foreign companies and foreign individuals who are involved in shady deals and kickbacks and schemes, essentially. Where is the money going? Because it's not going to the people of Congo.
Well, the president has a wonderful collection of gold Patek Philippe's, luxury watches. He has had some wonderful holidays in the south of France. He threw a multi-week-long birthday party in Dubai. So the money is not staying in Congo. Often, sometimes it's going to building shiny new developments along the river in Kinshasa, and sometimes it's going to politicians who are typically not from the mining regions. Sometimes it is going to politicians who are from those mining regions. They will take it out of the country and they will send it to South Africa, the traditional places where people hide their money around the world. But Dubai has become a kind of hotspot for that these days. It's just a constant stream of capital leaving the country. But also, you have to remember that being a politician in DRC or being a big man in DRC, these people are giving out huge amounts of money. I mean, to win an election in Congo is very, very expensive because you're paying off your supporters. You're paying off the people who are voting for you.
It trickles down.
Maybe that trickles. I'm not sure if that's the most accepted form of trickle-down economics, but maybe that's one of the few ways in which it trickles down. But obviously you can't build a country, you can't build an economy based on that. Now, there are stories about people going with stacks of $100 bills and throwing them out into crowds. If you think about it, it's crazy because that amount of money is a huge amount of money to people on the street in Congo.
Let's talk about the US versus China.
The current iteration is weighted towards China. The investment has dwindled from Europe and the US. and it has become pretty much dominated by China. That said, over the past 2 months, the administration of Donald Trump has tried to flip the switch and make US investment in Congo popular again. And we've seen two notable examples, one of which is buying a stake in the massive Glencore mine by a company that didn't exist until last October, seems to have backing from the US government. And also another big investment proposal to buy this company called Chemaf, or Chemicals of Africa, which was a sort of East African Indian-owned company that was doing a lot of mining, by a company that was founded by former Special Forces, US Special Forces operators. That hasn't actually gone through. I think now they've changed the leadership of this state-owned mining company in Congo, so we might see that going through quite soon. There have been a lot of change. This is a direct result of politics. This is a direct result of the war in the East and the current administration in Kinshasa's desire to have American support to win that war against a Rwandan-backed militia. Now, if that's complicated, it gets even more complicated when you think about different resources, which are also important for technology, which the militias are all fighting to take control of. And then there are sub-militias that are fighting. So it's all complicated, but it's this web of corruption, violence, politics, extraction, and exploitation that I tried to map out in the book, that some reviewers have found confusing, because it is confusing. And keeping track of it is difficult, and it changes day by day.
You're going to need some diagrams in the second edition of the book.
We'll definitely need some diagrams. I think it's always difficult to tell the publishers that you want diagrams.
You're listening to Non-Toxic. This episode is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, who've been making pure beeswax candles in Colorado for decades. The candles burn really clean, they smell great, and most importantly, they're not made with any petroleum products, so you can rest assured that when you light one, you are not lighting the planet on fire. Blue Corn Candles is offering a deal for non-toxic listeners. Use the code NONTOXIC20 at checkout, all caps, to get 20% off your first order. Now, back to my conversation with Nicolas. So, China currently dominates the world's battery supply chain, along with other sustainable tech like the production of solar panels. Can you discuss what role the Chinese government is playing on the ground in Congo, and what the lives of these Chinese workers and cobalt buyers are like? There was one guy that you spent a lot of time with, and I'm wondering if you can use his story as a way to talk about this bigger presence of China in DRC.
Kalala was a guy who's a bit older than me. He had grown up in a village. There was nobody to marry. In China, the unmarried men are called guangun, or bear branches. There are lots and lots of areas, especially in rural China, where the male-female gender balance is skewed because of the one-child policy. People did not want their only child to be a woman, so women were either discarded or killed or aborted or whatever it was. But basically, this created a huge imbalance in the distribution of sex in parts of rural China. And he was from such a part of rural China, and he said, look, I can't find a wife. I couldn't find a wife in my hometown, and heard that I can find a wife in Congo. So he went to Congo and he married a Congolese woman, and he said his life has been very difficult since that. So be careful for what you wish for, I guess. But his wife was sitting out on the doorstep with two half Chinese, half Congolese kids. And it was fascinating because he was there sort of chain smoking cigarettes and talking about how good he was at business. But his situation didn't seem that great. Kalala, he took the name because it's a name of an ancient Luba king. And I think he wanted to make some kind of common cause with the Congolese workers. Look, you have two different types of Chinese investment in Congo. You have investment that is very much on the ground and is led by people who've gone out almost like pioneers in the Old West. China had this policy in 2000 called Going Out, which was expounded upon by the premier at the time, Shang Jin. And Jiang told Chinese to go out and build businesses and to build the glory of China outside of its borders. And it marked the end of the isolationist period of the country since the days of the Cultural Revolution, when many people did not go abroad. And now the Chinese government was encouraging people to go abroad, and they went to Africa. These people are doing it because they think that it's too difficult to make a living in China is a big part of it.
The story of so many imperial ventures, right? The people who are sailing around the world under various European banners, often it's because they're the third son of somebody and they don't feel that they have good economic prospects in their home country, and maybe they can find some treasure abroad. What was his business? Like, what was he doing there?
So he had some sort of permit, he had some sort of connection with the artisanal mining industry through this character called Antoine, who was his kind of Congolese frontman. Antoine was also a complicated character. He also had some farming business. I think at one point he had a car repair shop as well. So he had various different little businesses that he was building up around Kolwezi in the desire to build it into some great big business that he could come back to China and be proud of, I'm sure. And there have been examples of this. One of the characters in the book is this guy called Chen Hui. Chen Hui was the founder of a company called Huayo. And Huayo Cobalt is one of the biggest buyers of artisanally mined cobalt in the world. It is also a huge company with like Apple-style campuses in China and has been built basically out of a workshop that this guy had in a shed in his backyard kind of thing, where he was refining metal in a very crude way with a buddy of his. His big boost for success was coming to Congo and setting up shop and buying artisanally mined cobalt and bringing in more and more workers to do this over and over and over again and building up his kind of empire of cobalt.
So he's buying these rocks taken out of these pits. What is he doing with the rocks, and how are they getting to China?
They do a primary, a first in factories in Congo and Zambia, just over the border to the south. It's refined into this powder called cobalt hydroxide, this kind of greenish, like bright turquoise powder. The cover of the book has a piece of cobalt rock, which is that color. And that cobalt hydroxide is then shipped down usually to Durban or to Dar es Salaam, and then shipped across the sea to China, where it is further refined into various forms of cobalt oxide and so on that are useful in batteries. Those are called battery precursors.
And everything is shipped by truck, right?
Basically, there is a railroad which has been revived by the Chinese in Angola. It took a very long time to connect it to the DRC, but 90% of refining happens in China. It makes more graphic sense to send it east and to send it along these roads where there are these trucks. And then for Congolese politics, it makes sense because politicians control the border crossings and the taxes that people are paying, and they also control the trucking companies as well. So it's another boondoggle for those in power.
And Kalala, what was his role in all this? Was he trying to buy cobalt from artisanal miners and sell that up the chain to a bigger person who would be shipping it off?
That was one of the things that Kalala was doing. He was a trader, so he would be buying and selling and potentially have a share of a shipment going out to China and so on. But he wasn't working for any big Chinese company or anything like that. He was a kind of independent agent. So it's funny because we think of Chinese investment and emigration to Africa and so on in terms of like a directed thing from the state. But these people are kind of also very independent. So you have to think of them as these Wild West saloon owners who are trading gold nuggets out the back. That's what you're dealing with here. And oftentimes they have very few scruples about buying from children or operating in what they call a tough environment, giving bribes. The Chinese government is not famous for enforcing its version of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's sort of, for them, very much Wild West.
The Congolese, how do they feel about the presence of the Chinese in their country?
I think there are many Congolese who are upset about it. There's a great deal of dislike for Chinese, but they have seen Europe and the US retreat from interacting with their country. And they say, these are the only people that we have to deal with. Oftentimes they'll have riots and they'll burn Chinese shops. And then a month later, there'll be more new Chinese who move in. So I don't think it's a stable relationship. I don't think there's much love lost. But I think most people see them as just a natural part of the world or a necessity for the global economy to go around.
Toward the end of the book, You talk about getting arrested because of the reporting that you were doing, and you were held in prison by the country's secret police, and you were accused of being a spy. Can you talk about the events that led up to that moment, and then what exactly occurred? Why were you arrested, and what was that experience like?
I was detained by the secret police and taken to something that was not a jail. It was a detention site run by the main directorate of the secret police. I was looking into the connection between artisanal mining and a separatist militia in the south, which was involved in all political games and pressure by different generals in the army on mining regions. This was a group called the Bakata Katanga. I was interviewing former members of the Bakata Katanga. And at one point, this guy said, the Bakata Katanga is supported by artisanal mining revenue. And I said, that's very interesting, because the idea that your iPhone could actually be indirectly paying for this violent group definitely...
Or your EV. I mean,
or your EV, yeah, exactly.
You're supposed to feel better about yourself when you buy an EV, and to know that you're funding global instability through that purchase adds a whole new layer to it.
I said to them, look, prove it. I don't really believe you. It seemed a bit crazy. And they said, well, you can meet our boss. And I said, well, okay, I'll meet your boss. Their boss was this guy called Gedeon Kyungu, who was a reputed cannibal. And they said, oh, no, he's very nice. He'll come and meet you in a hotel lobby in Zambia because it's safe for him there. I said, fine, sure. And they said, would you be ready to meet him in Zambia? And it was very weird because the guy was recording me on his phone. I was like, yeah, sure, I'll be ready to meet him in Zambia. We'll have an interview about mining. And the guy was like, okay. And then he started trying to ask me the question in various other ways. And I kept saying, look, I'd love to have a journalistic interview with him. That's just like how, what we can do. And he was like, can you help him? I said, no, can't help him, but I'm happy to do an interview with him if he'd like to speak to me. So that kind of went on after meeting after meeting. But they were telling me interesting things along the way. But it was just weird. They had this kind of weird attention on me. And what happened was there was another period where Antoine, this guy who I was speaking about a little bit earlier, the guy with Kalala, had offered me to look at corruption involving the president and the controlling of artisanal mining cooperatives. There are these cooperatives of artisanal miners who do the mining and they're licensed under the law. This is a totally legal part of economic life in that part of the world, but they're not supposed to be owned by anybody, especially politicians and especially very high-ranking politicians. And that guy says, oh, pay me some money and I can show you how the president's involved in this cooperative. And I was like, look, Antoine, I'm not going to pay you money. Like, there's this important tenet of journalism, whatever. He was like, you'll see, you've been looking into the wrong things. He was quite drunk as well at that point. Anyway, I went to meet with these people who'd been trying to set up the rebel interview. And they had these other people who were supposed to be emissaries from the rebel leader. And suddenly there were troops armed surrounding the hotel that I was in. This is in the town of Lubumbashi. And I was kind of being dragged out, and my translator was also targeted. And various other people were taken along with me, the people that I was interviewing. And it was clear to me whether that was being done as a ruse. I think it was for some of them, and some of them were involved in this weird entrapment thing that was happening. First, I was held in a conference room for a day. They couldn't figure out what to do with me. And then I was put on a plane and sent across the country. While I was on the plane, I was able to pass 2 notes. I wasn't tortured. I was jostled around a bit, and some stuff of mine was stolen, but it wasn't like I was beaten, or like people were generally quite nice to me and sort of added me on Facebook at the end. I'm friends with the soldier who stood outside my cell with a machine gun. He was like, put me on Facebook, bro. It's cool chatting with you. And then the head of the secret police interrogated me twice in front of the US consul. I mean, it was really dramatic.
What were they doing? It must have been clear you were a journalist.
I had a piece of paper saying, this guy is an accredited journalist. I had gone above and beyond to accredit myself, and I did not want to get into trouble. It wasn't as if I was doing some deep, Bush thing where it snuck across the border. And I was sitting in a hotel, having lunch with these people. It wasn't that threatening. I mean, they could have just said, look, we're going to put you on a plane and take you to the airport. But instead, it was done in a way that was very much like, you should not be looking into this. Nobody else should be looking into this. It started this wave of repression against foreign and Congolese journalists It was very much a situation in which people started getting arrested. This is continuing now, and it's being targeted at political figures. I don't want to say it was the first, but it essentially was a strategy of repression. I think the government was interested in other journalists seeing that and thinking, okay, we don't want to put our nose into whatever they're doing here because we don't want to get kicked out. We don't want to be sent out as persona non grata. But for the foreign journalists, we were all treated fine. The Congolese journalist and the journalist who was with me as well, Jeff Kazadi, was kept in prison for another 2 weeks. He had very little to eat. He was not treated particularly well. He wasn't tortured. He was treated okay. He said he had some interesting chats with his guards. That was a scary situation as well, because I think that was probably the worst part of that entire thing, knowing that this person who had come along with me was still in jail for 2 weeks after. It was as if I was living in suspended animation, because you feel as if you've been, especially when you're being transported from the airport to the detention center, you look out the window and you're like, wow, look at all these people living their lives. And I have absolutely no agency or control over what I'm doing right now. And somebody could just take me out back and shoot me. And maybe that person would have consequences, but it's not going to change that much. So yeah, there was an element that was quite scary.
Did the Congolese just decide, oh, he's not a spy, it's fine, or maybe even the spying thing was a pretense, or was there pressure from the US government to get you released?
I think our old boss, David Remnick, was amazing during that whole period. He interviewed Blinken, so he just called him up and said, you're the Secretary of State, what can we do? It was a strange way that he found out, which was that my note got passed to somebody at the US Embassy that I'd passed on the plane. The note that I passed on the plane got passed to somebody on the US Embassy, and the US Embassy then told a Financial Times journalist, who then told a New Yorker journalist at a bar in Nairobi. It was kind of a weird confluence of events, but it meant that very quickly Remnick knew, and then he got Ben Taub, who's a staff writer. Ben went to my parents, and I think there was a concerted effort on all sides. I think the Congolese government were surprised that they were receiving calls from the US Embassy that quickly. The US Embassy was already making calls. And I remember somebody was like, oh, you're going to get out because they know you're here. They know you're here. But they had been denying that I'd been taken for 2 days beforehand, because I had missed a call with my dad, actually. And he sort of suspected that something was up. And he had called the US Embassy the next morning, and the embassy called the government. They said, no, we don't know where he is. We don't know where he is. 2 days until they admitted where I was. And that was a period of like enforced disappearance, which obviously is a really brutal and terrible and terrifying thing to happen to a family. So in a way, they suffered a lot more.
You kept a journal during this time? Can you talk about that?
So the journal that I kept, it was written in matchsticks that I had attached to the end of plastic spoons that I had been given. Why I had been given plastic spoons was kind of beyond me, because I didn't have any food. I had a couple of sardines that I had in my bag. Anyway, but it was lucky because they were useful. They'd taken away all my pens, but they hadn't taken away my notebooks. I was able to, in a notebook I think that I had pilfered from the New Yorker supply cabinet just before I left, to scribble out this diary, which I was looking at the other day, and it's pretty desultory. It's like, nothing happened today, didn't eat anything, I'm going mad, that kind of thing. And you're kept in a white room and taken out for these mindlessly stupid interrogations.
Are places like Congo doomed to be sacrifice zones for the energy transition? Or is there a way for these people to share in the wealth they're creating?
It's a very difficult question to answer. My one answer to that question comes from an example that I saw when I was in Congo, and I talk about in the afterword to the book, which is a town that is kind of central to the history of southern Congo. It has this traditional king who is essentially somebody who is kind of, a thoughtful and benevolent ruler of his people, and has invested the huge amount of money that they have made off mining into things like agriculture and building a small university and roads. A very small amount of money in the scheme of things. I can't remember exactly how much it was, but it was in the tens of millions. For that part of the world, it's a lot, and that's annually. And the difference between that town and other places, I think with rule of law, accountability for corruption, and a lack of impunity for things like war crimes and so on, Congo doesn't have to be a sacrifice. And the thing is that electric vehicles are They're great technology. The lithium-ion battery is an amazing thing. Yet it relies on this supply chain, which nobody in their right mind would design, because I think it exists because of historical happenstance, because of colonial extraction methods, because of the way that the geology works. And there are many different reasons for the supply chain being like this. But that does not mean that we should continue with it and launch ourselves into what has been called an amoral free-for-all in order to build technology that we think is ethically better. I don't think electric vehicles are a problem, but I do think like sourcing child mined cobalt is a problem. Of course it is. When we talk about recycling these days, I think that's great. I think it's wonderful to use recycled materials. But if we're not mining any cobalt from Congo and we're only using recycled materials at this point, what are Congolese people left with? They're left with a bunch of holes in the ground, and the West has its iPhones and electric vehicles. China and so on have their electric vehicles and iPhones, and these countries are left poorer than ever.
Nicolas, thank you so much for coming on Non-Toxic. Thank you for writing this book, The Elements of Power. Where can the people find it? How can they learn more about the battery supply chain?
You can order it in your local bookstore. You can go to Amazon. You can buy it on Audible. It's a Kindle book. It's there. It's out in the world. There's an excerpt in Vanity Fair if you want to try it out. There's an excerpt in The Nation.
Are you on tour as well?
I have a sponsored talk in New York at the end of next month. I've been to Philly. I have 3 events in Paris, at the American Library in Paris, and then in New York. It seems like things are cropping up every now and then.
What is the magazine called that you're starting?
I'm recording from this new magazine office called Now Voyager.
It's me, a bunch of people who used to work at The New Yorker.
We realized that US magazines were doing less global coverage, and we thought, how cool would it be to have a magazine that did that for Anglophone readers?
And we're going to have amazing photography, amazing art, and just really great storytelling.
Nicolas, thank you so much for coming on Non-Toxic. And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. As always, I'm your host, Daniel Penny. Artwork is by Sam Creasy, and the music is by Nathan Sharp. This episode was sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, but it's the support of listeners like you that really makes it possible. If you have been listening and supporting the show for a while, head over to substack.com/nontoxicpodcast/subscribe and become a paying subscriber. It's really the only way that I can afford to keep this show going. Subscribers get access to special content, including episodes that only subscribers can listen to, posts that are only for subscribers, and a group chat on Substack that I'm calling the Sweat Lodge, which is kind of a open space for listeners of the show to chat with each other, ask me questions, and get to hang out with their fellow detoxifiers. It's just getting started in there, but I think it's a cool space, and I'm hoping to make it into a regular part of what Non-Toxic does. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.